By the time the westbound coach vanished behind the white ridge, Ruth Bellamy understood exactly what had happened. The driver was not coming back, and neither was the man who had promised to marry her. She stood beneath the dead telegraph wires at Blackwater Relay, 37 years old, 8 months pregnant, with one carpet bag at her feet and 6 cents in her glove. The relay house had been boarded shut for winter. The road behind her was filling with snow, and under the sagging roof across the yard, a stranger had watched Amos Vale climb back onto the coach alone. He was broad-shouldered, bearded, and still in the way mountain men become still when they are deciding whether danger has noticed them. Ruth tightened both hands around the handle of her bag. The stranger crossed the yard. Snow creaked beneath his boots. "You were meant to leave with that coach," he said. Ruth lifted her chin. "So was my future." The man looked once at her swollen belly, then at the darkening road. "The pass will close before sunset. I can see that. My place is 3 miles north." No, he did not argue. He only took off one leather glove and pointed toward the relay door. "Those boards will not stop the wind. There is no stove inside. By midnight, the cold will be inside your bones." Ruth's jaw tightened. "And what does your roof cost?" For the first time something changed in his face. Not anger, something older. "Under my roof," he said. "Warmth is not a bargain." Then he picked up her carpet bag. Ruth should have snatched it back. Instead, another gust struck the platform so hard she had to brace one hand against the post. The baby shifted low inside her. The stranger waited. He did not touch her. He did not offer promises. He simply stood between her and the wind. "My name is Caleb Dorne," he said. "You can distrust me beside a fire." Caleb's cabin stood above a frozen creek, half hidden by fir trees and smoke. It was not the lonely shack Ruth had imagined. It was a working place, split cedar stacked under an awning. 2 draft horses in a stone-backed barn, snowshoes beside the door, a chopping block worn smooth by years of use. Inside, the room smelled of pine smoke, coffee, and saddle soap. Caleb set her bag near a narrow bed tucked behind a curtain. "You sleep there." "Where do you sleep?" He nodded toward a bench beside the stove. Ruth stared at him. "I will not put a man out of his own bed. You are not putting me anywhere. I am choosing." That word unsettled her more than an order would have. Choosing. Amos had used the same word whenever he wanted something. He had chosen the train west, chosen the mining camps, chosen the name their child would carry, and that afternoon, he had chosen to step back onto the coach with Ruth's savings hidden inside his coat. Caleb poured stew into a clay bowl and placed it on the table. Ruth did not sit. "I can sew," she said. "I can mend shirts, blankets, harness lining. I keep clean accounts. I will work for what I eat." Caleb leaned one hand on the chair. "Work if it helps you stand straight." Then his voice lowered. "But your supper is not wages." Ruth sat. She ate slowly at first, then too quickly to hide how hungry she was. Caleb noticed. He pretended not to. That was the first kindness she trusted. The next morning, Ruth woke to axe blows in the yard. The storm had passed, leaving the world sharp and blue. Caleb had already carried water, fed the horses, and cleared a path to the privy wide enough for her careful steps. On the table sat oatmeal, dried apples, and a note written in an uneven hand. "Eat before the child begins kicking complaints." Ruth almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she folded the note and placed it beneath the tin cup. By noon, she found a basket of torn tack beside the stove. The leather padding had split. 2 girth straps had come loose. A saddle skirt was coming apart at the edge. She threaded her heaviest needle. When Caleb returned, snow dusting his beard, every piece had been repaired. He turned the saddle skirt over in his hands. "This will hold longer than the original. It was badly cut. I cut it." Ruth looked up. Caleb looked at the stitching again. Then, very quietly, he said, "That explains it." A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. It startled them both. After that, the cabin began to change in small ways. Not prettier, more alive. Ruth patched the flour sacks into curtains that kept the night glare off the windows. She sorted Caleb's receipts into a ledger and discovered that a cattle buyer in Laramie had shorted him twice on freight weight. Caleb read the figures 3 times. "You are sure? I am a seamstress, not a fool." He rode to town the next morning and returned with $42 the buyer had suddenly remembered owing him. He set half of it beside Ruth's sewing basket. She pushed it back. "That is yours. It was lost until you found it. I will take 5. 21.8. He studied her expression. 10 and a new pair of boots. Ruth looked down at the cracked leather around her toes. 12 and no argument over the boots. Caleb nodded. It was the first bargain between them that did not feel like a trap. Days gathered. Then weeks. Caleb never asked who the baby's father was. He never asked why Ruth woke some nights with her breath trapped in her throat. He never asked why she flinched when a horse approached too quickly from behind. He simply made room. A stool appeared beside the washtub. A rail appeared along the icy steps. A small stack of clean linen appeared in the chest near the bed. One evening Ruth found Caleb carving a piece of ash wood by lamplight. The shape in his hands was curved and smooth, a cradle runner. She stopped in the doorway. "You are building that for the baby." Caleb kept his eyes on the wood. "The floor is cold. You do not even know if we will still be here." His knife stopped. "No," he said. "I do not." Ruth waited for him to add something. He did not. That restraint was becoming dangerous. It made her want to believe him. On the first morning of February, hoofbeats climbed the frozen creek road. Caleb was in the barn setting a shoe on the gray mare. Ruth stood at the window and watched a bay horse come through the trees. The rider wore a black wool coat with a velvet collar. Amos Vale had always dressed one station above the life he actually lived. Her body recognized him before her mind did. The baby turned hard beneath her ribs. Amos dismounted smiling. He carried a leather document case under one arm. When Ruth opened the door, he removed his hat as though arriving for Sunday dinner. "There you are," he said. Ruth said nothing. His eyes moved past her into the cabin, the curtains, the swept floor, the half-built cradle near the stove. His smile tightened. "You have made yourself comfortable. You took my money. We needed traveling funds. You left me at a closed relay in a storm. I made a poor decision." "No, you made several careful ones." Caleb stepped out of the barn. He did not carry a rifle, only a farrier's hammer. Somehow that was worse. Amos looked him up and down. "So this is Dorne. You know my name?" Caleb asked. "I asked in town. They say you keep to yourself. I prefer it. They also say your wife died here." Caleb's face did not move. Ruth felt the cruelty in the sentence land anyway. Amos turned back to her and opened the document case. "I came to repair what happened." He unfolded a paper stamped with a county seal. Ruth did not reach for it. "What is that?" "Your mother's parcel outside Rawlins, 40 acres along the survey route." Ruth frowned. "That land is scrub and stone." It was. "The Union Spur has shifted north. A freight company wants the right-of-way." Now she understood. Not all at once, worse than that, piece by piece. Amos had not returned because he regretted leaving her. He had returned because land with her name on it had become valuable. "The offer is $800, he said. "More if we act quickly. Sign the transfer, come back with me, and we can begin again." Ruth looked at the paper, then at the man holding it. "You knew about the survey before we left Abilene." Amos's eyes flickered. "That was enough. You brought me west for my signature. I brought you west because we had plans. You brought me west because a pregnant woman is easier to frighten when she has no family nearby." Caleb came to stand at the foot of the steps. His voice was quiet. "You should leave." Amos ignored him. "Ruth, think. That money belongs to our child. Our child belonged to you at Blackwater Relay." Amos's jaw hardened. "It is my blood." That did not keep her warm. The word "her" hung in the air. Ruth had never said it aloud before. A daughter. She did not know how she knew. She only did. Amos held out the pen. "Sign." Ruth took the document. Relief loosened his shoulders. Then she tore the paper once, twice, 4 times. The pieces fell between them like pale leaves. Amos stared at the snow. When he looked up, the charm was gone. "You think this man will keep feeding another man's child?" Caleb answered, before Ruth could. "I think you have mistaken feeding someone for owning them." Amos stepped toward him. Caleb did not move. The farrier's hammer hung loose in his hand. No threat, no performance, just fact. Amos stopped. Then Ruth felt the first pain. It cinched around her body so suddenly the porch rail leaped into her grip. Caleb was beside her at once. Amos took one step back. Ruth breathed through her teeth. "It is too early," she whispered. Another pain came before the first had fully released. Caleb looked at the darkening sky. Clouds had swallowed the ridge. The storm was returning. "We need Mrs. Pike," he said. "She is 6 miles down valley." Amos glanced toward his horse. "I can ride." Caleb looked at him. "Then ride." Amos did not move. The wind shoved snow across the yard in thin white sheets. Amos looked at Ruth, then at the torn contract near his boots. "Give me your word you will sign another copy." Ruth stared at him. Even Caleb seemed not to understand at first. Amos swallowed. "I am not risking my neck through that pass for nothing." The next pain bent Ruth nearly double. Caleb caught her before she hit the steps. Amos backed toward his horse. "I will send help from town." "You will not reach town," Caleb said. But Amos was already in the saddle. Within moments the trees had swallowed him. The last thing Ruth heard was the frantic beat of hooves disappearing beneath the wind, the same sound as the coach, the same choice. Only this time she was not surprised. By nightfall the road was gone. Snow pressed against the windows, the wind screamed down the chimney and blew ash across the hearth. Ruth's labor came hard and fast. Caleb moved the table, boiled water, stacked wood beside the stove, and opened a small tin box Ruth had never seen before. Inside were clean cord, folded cloth, a narrow pair of scissors, and a brown glass bottle. Ruth gripped the bed frame. "You have done this before?" Caleb's hands stopped for half a second. No, fear rose in her face. He met it. "But I learned what to do." Another contraction took her voice. Caleb knelt beside the bed. "Listen to me. I will not lie to you. I am afraid." Ruth squeezed her eyes shut. "So am I know." He held out his hand. "But I am not leaving." Hour after hour he proved it. He cooled her face when fever climbed. He counted her breathing when panic made it shallow. He kept the fire alive with one hand and held her upright with the other. When she cursed Amos, Caleb let her. When she cursed him, he let her do that too. Near midnight, Ruth began to weaken. The pain stayed fierce, but her strength did not. Caleb saw it. His voice changed. Not louder, stronger. "Ruth, look at me." She could barely open her eyes. "You crossed 2 states carrying this child. You survived a man who counted your fear as money. You stood in a storm and tore up the future he tried to sell you. Do not give him the last word now." Something inside her answered. Not hope, anger. Sometimes anger is the rope a person needs before hope is strong enough to hold. Ruth bore down. The storm struck the roof. Caleb told her again. Then the room changed. A small body slipped into his waiting hands. For one impossible second there was no sound. Caleb bent over the child. He cleared her mouth, rubbed her back, wrapped her in warm linen. Nothing. Ruth lifted her head. "Why is she quiet?" Caleb did not answer. His hands were trembling now. He rubbed harder. "Come on," he whispered. "You fought too far to stop here." The baby jerked. A thin cry broke free. Then another, louder, angrier. Alive. Ruth collapsed against the pillows, laughing and sobbing at once. Caleb placed the child against her chest. The baby's hair was dark and damp. Her fists were already clenched. "A girl," Caleb said. "I knew. You did, I hoped." He turned away to hide his face. Ruth saw anyway, the tears, the grief beneath them, the relief. "Caleb." He stayed facing the fire. "Why did you have that box?" The cabin went quiet except for the wind and the child's small breaths. Caleb sat on the bench. 11 years ago, my wife went into labor during a spring flood. Ruth listened. "I thought courage meant staying calm. I thought help would arrive because help was supposed to arrive." His eyes fixed on the flames. It did not. Ruth's hand closed around the blanket. Caleb continued. "After I buried Sarah and our son, I rode to Cheyenne and paid a doctor to teach me everything he could. Then I learned from every midwife who would tolerate my questions." He looked at the tin box. "I never wanted to stand useless in that room again." Ruth understood then. The cleared steps, the linen, the cradle, the way he never made kindness sound noble. He was not trying to replace what he had lost. He was refusing to repeat the man he had been when loss came for him. Ruth looked down at her daughter. "You were not useless tonight." Caleb's mouth tightened. "No." "Say it." He looked at her. "You were not useless." A long breath left him. "I was not useless." For the first time since she had met him, Caleb Dorne looked less like a man built to survive storms and more like a man who had finally stepped out of one. Morning found the cabin buried nearly to the eaves. The storm had passed. Sunlight turned the snowfield bright enough to hurt the eyes. Caleb dug a tunnel to the barn. Ruth slept with the baby tucked against her. For 3 days no one came. On the 4th, Mrs. Pike arrived on snowshoes, furious at the weather, furious at men in general, and especially furious that Caleb had cut the cord half an inch too long. The baby was healthy. Ruth was weak but safe. Amos never sent help. What he sent 2 weeks later was a letter. Caleb placed it unopened beside Ruth's bowl. She recognized the handwriting. Inside, Amos explained that the storm had forced him east. He said he had always intended to return. He said the freight company had raised its offer to $1,200. He said marriage would protect her reputation. He said the child deserved his name. Ruth read the letter once, then she carried it to the stove. Caleb watched from the doorway. "You do not have to burn it on my account." "I am not." She fed the first page into the fire. "This is on mine." The paper curled black around Amos's promises. The county deed remained hers. In spring, Ruth sold only a narrow right-of-way, kept the rest of the land, and used part of the money to buy 3 milk cows for Caleb's place. He protested until she showed him a written partnership agreement. No charity, she said. Caleb read the page. No ownership, he replied. They shook hands over the kitchen table. By summer, Ruth had turned the front room into a sewing shop 2 days a week. Ranch wives rode in with torn dresses, worn quilts, and gossip from 20 miles in every direction. Caleb built shelves, then a second window, then a small room onto the east wall where morning light could reach the cradle. He never asked Ruth to stay. That began to trouble her. One evening, with the creek running full and green shoots lifting through the last patches of snow, she found him repairing a fence above the house. Their daughter slept against Ruth's chest in a sling. Ruth stopped beside him. "Do you plan to keep building rooms for people who might leave?" Caleb rested both hands on the post. "I plan to build what is needed." That is not an answer. No, she waited. He looked toward the cabin. Smoke from the chimney bent softly in the spring wind. "I do not want gratitude mistaken for love," he said, "and I do not want safety mistaken for a debt." Ruth felt the truth of that all the way down. Amos had always hurried her toward the answer that served him. Caleb had spent months protecting her right not to answer at all. She stepped closer. "What if it is neither gratitude nor debt?" Caleb's eyes met hers. "What is it?" Ruth looked at the man who had offered warmth without a bargain, at the house that had made room before it had made claims, at the child sleeping peacefully between them. Then she placed his rough hand against the baby's back. "It is a choice," she said. Caleb's fingers trembled beneath hers. This time, when he smiled, there was no storm behind it, only room. Ruth Bellamy had arrived at Blackwater Relay carrying a child, a torn future, and 6 cents in her glove. She left nothing there, not her name, not her dignity, not even the part of her that still believed every kindness came with a price, because the man who saved her did not ask her to become his. He made certain she could remain her own, and that was why she chose him.